I want us to become brothers again like we used to be, and for us to find ourselves and bond with each other. Can we agree to that?
Opinions vary.
Welcome to Three Brothers Filmcast, a monthly roundtable podcast where the brothers behind Three Brothers Film discuss chosen movies, as well as broader topics in film culture. As always, thank you so much for listening. If you've enjoyed our discussions, please think about dropping a 5-star rating or a review, or recommending us to your family and friends. We're always looking to expand our audience, bring more people into the conversation, and 5-star reviews help new listeners find us and help us carve out a niche for quality, nuanced conversations about movies. I'm Aaron Bergstrom, and I'm here with my brothers,
Anders,
and Anton.
My last name is the same as my brother's.
And this week we're talking about the return of movie theaters after a year of pandemic closures. But first, a roundtable discussion of F9 The Fast Saga, the latest film in the Fast and Furious franchise, the surprisingly long-running series about people driving fast cars and saving the world.
Okay, Ramblers, let's get rambling.
All right, Dom. What's next?
No matter how fast you are,
I am not to be compared to you.
no one outruns their past.
I am more easy, you trying your best to become me.
And mine just caught up to me.
Been a long time, Dom.
We live in the age of the franchise. Studios like Disney have a functional monopoly on Hollywood and have made it so that almost all major Hollywood releases rely on a franchise model of endless sequels, spin-offs, and remakes. Across Disney, Warner Brothers, Sony, Universal, and the streaming studios, including Netflix, Amazon, and Apple, franchises such as Marvel, Star Wars, DC, and Harry Potter have dominated the box office and taken up the majority of screens at multiplexes around the world. These franchises operate on the filmmaking logic pioneered by Marvel, which is that every film needs to rely on a pre-established IP, extend the brand, and necessitate the further engagement of the viewer with the franchise. There could be formal and genre innovations within each individual film, but only insofar as these innovations don't deviate from the franchise formula and preclude the promise of future installments. The Fast and Furious saga is the rare franchise to seem as much a Hollywood throwback as a product of this modern cinematic universe ethos. It certainly embodies the excessive use of CGI and mass-scale destruction that personifies modern blockbusters. It also has an expanding story world mythology and a large cast of characters, some of which have already gotten their own spin-off films. But the series isn't based on pre-existing IP, nor has it produced nearly as much ancillary content as the average Hollywood franchise. Furthermore, the series is still fueled by the simpler interests of tough men, beautiful women, fast cars, and big explosions. The series has also rapidly shifted over the years. The first several films were more interested in street racing subculture than larger action-moving plotting. The first film, The Fast and the Furious, which came out in 2001, was essentially Point Break with street racing, and was largely an avenue for then-ascending stars Paul Walker and Vin Diesel, who played the series leads Brian O'Connor and Dominic Toretto. Too Fast, Too Furious continued the racing focus, but switched the action over to Florida from LA in the first film, and Tokyo Drift took the series to Japan to look at the drift racing subculture in Tokyo. But the series began to shift in 2009 with Fast and Furious. Fast and Furious once again paired Vin Diesel and Paul Walker together, but its plot had more to do with international crime than street racing. Fast 5, widely considered the best film in the series, added Dwayne Johnson to the fold and took the crime plot even further in its full-blown heist storytelling set in Rio de Janeiro. Fast and Furious 6 added espionage elements while upping the scale of the action, and by Furious 7 the series had transcended its racing roots and become an action extravaganza with gravity-defying stunts and full-blown action spectacle. The Fate of the Furious continued the upward trend towards large-scale spectacle, with a world-threatening villain and massive action sequences set in New York City and the Russian Arctic, one famously involving a nuclear submarine. The latest entry in the franchise, F9 The Fast Saga, continues the escalation of scale and spectacle that's occurred over the course of the series. It's not a spoiler to say the racers finally go to space in this film, which makes literal a long-running joke made by fans of the franchise. But F9 is also more indebted to the melodramatic roots of the series than the past couple films. Justin Lin, who directed entries 3 through 6, returns to the series with F9 and doubles down on a lot of the elements he introduced in his previous films, most notably the thematic and narrative focus on family. Here, Dom's long-lost brother Jacob, played by John Cena, arrives to terrorize the world, forcing Dom and his team to not only save the world, but deal with his unresolved family issues in the process. F9 is a massive-scale, overly long action extravaganza, much like many Marvel movies, but it doesn't exist purely to extend the tendrils of the franchise like those Disney-made properties. It indulges in the snarky humor and action escalation of modern blockbusters, most notably in its space sequence, but it's also more focused on stunt work and practical filmmaking ingenuity than the typical Hollywood blockbuster. It's a complicated, globe-spanning action epic, but at its core it's also a simple story about the relationship between two brothers. My own thoughts on the movie are already public, as I posted a review of F9 on the site a few weeks back, but I'm curious about your guys' thoughts. Am I overstating the uniqueness of the Fast and Furious saga, or is it just another franchise in an era of franchises? So I'm going to start with you, Anton, since you haven't seen any of the other films in the series, except for maybe the first one.
I've seen the first one, yeah.
So, coming in cold, is F9 a fun summer action movie with some simple blockbuster pleasures, or yet another example of Hollywood's franchise oversaturation?
I'm going to frame my response by telling a little story. So I'm a big Harry Potter fan. I read all the books and watched all the movies. And when I went to Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2, so the final installment in that franchise, I went with a friend who had only seen maybe the first movie. And we're sitting down to watch it. He seems like he's enjoying it. And as the movie goes on, he leans over to me and says, Anton, who's the guy with no nose? And I was just like, I'm like, what can you take out of this movie if you have no idea who Voldemort is when you're the seventh film, Part 2? And that's part of my experience of seeing this movie. I kept leaning over to Anders and being like, who's this? Who's this guy walking in? Why does this matter? And Anders are filling me in on some of the characters and their backgrounds and, how this is actually the mom of this person. And so there's definitely a whole side, which I think is part of the pleasure of this series, that I'm not accessing. In terms of just as a summer blockbuster and hitting the movie theater and seeing a movie like this, I feel like it's passable entertainment. I found it moderately engaging. Probably more sour on the action and more into actually the characters. I just kind of enjoyed hanging out with some of the characters, particularly Dom, but I did think Roman and Ludacris's character were funny. But I wasn't blown away by the action, and I'm not necessarily going to go back and rewatch the series.
How about you, Anders? I know you've been catching up on the other movies over the past few weeks.
I had seen the first 3. Yeah, actually, first 4, roughly in the years that they came out. I think I saw the first one in the theater. I caught the second, third, and fourth on video when they came out. But then I kind of lost track of the series. Other interests in life and filmmaking or film watching kind of goes through phases, right, where you have sort of different tastes for different types of things. But I decided before I was going to see F9, I was going to binge through the whole series. So I actually rewatched all the first few and caught up with 5, 6, 7, 8. Still haven't seen Hobbs and Shaw. And I probably definitely will go and watch it in the next couple weeks. So I came to it having had a condensed. I'm not a longtime fan of the series, but coming to it with a sort of condensed experience of it. So the connections really flowed really well for me in F9. I really, the stuff that continued on, themes and sort of minor character arcs that were explored in 5, 6, 7. I enjoyed some of that stuff. But I also think that I actually was, like Anton, I enjoyed some of the character stuff more than I thought I would. The flashbacks to, young Dom and Jacob and all that stuff. The action, there's a couple scenes. I thought the opening jungle chase in Mexico or Monte Quinto or whatever, it was pretty good because it ends in such a ludicrous fashion that
the rope.
With the swinging out over the bridge. Or after Jake does the catch with the drone.
Yeah, I preferred the plane being caught by the airplane.
But it totally at that point, it's something that sort of you started in number 6 with ideas we're gonna pull down a plane with a bunch of cars stopped from taking off and stuff like that. This it's the logic of children playing with action figures, right? It really is now his plane comes in and it catches the car as it's taking off, so I didn't go down into the cliff. And that's the stuff I actually kind of like about this series. It's not cynical and knowing. It's truly the joy of a kid playing with his toys.
So I think that's an interesting point, and I think that's actually a part of the element in the filmmaking of this series. There's one series, modern series, that actually overlaps quite well with the Fast and Furious movies in terms of timeline and then also structure, and it's the Mission Impossible series. So this franchise around the 5th movie essentially was like, let's just become Mission Impossible with cars. You got the team, we're going to do world-spanning, globe-spanning saving stuff, and we're going to have bigger and bigger scale, and more importantly, we're going to structure the films around the set pieces. So I remember listening to a Christopher McQuarrie really long interview back when he made Fifth. Is it the Fifth? Yeah.
Rogue Nation?
Rogue Nation.
Yeah.
And he was talking about the way they come up with the screenplay. And it's essentially he writes it as they get greenlit to like different locations around the world. So they have a skeleton of the story structure. Him and Tom Cruise talk over the things, but they don't actually have a full screenplay written. The screenplay shifts depending on where they're going because it has to suit the location, but it also has to suit what you can actually get done there in terms of scale. But it's like, we know that he has to end up at this point, and we need to have 1, 2, 3 action extravaganzas to get there. And once you come up with those action points and where they're going to happen, then you have to come up with the stunt that you haven't done before. And once you come up with that, you fill the story around the stunt. And I totally think the movie like this operates off that principle. Obviously, I wasn't there when they're filming it, but like jungle scene. Okay, we're gonna have the awesome rope. We're gonna have the chase through the jungle, and then we're gonna have the rope bridge jump and the like magnet airplane flyaway drone. Then we're gonna have the sequence in London, the car chase. The kind of like not really important scene with Helen Mirren showing up in a cameo.
Okay, yeah, the Helen Mirren one.
And then we're gonna have the space sequence with the rocket cars. And then simultaneously, we're going to have the magnet
Tbilisi
extravaganza
chase, magnet car chase in Tbilisi, Georgia.
Also, there's the Edinburgh, which I thought
Yeah.
was actually one of my favorite scenes.
Yeah, when he's zip lining, when Jacob is
And when they
ziplining
catch him
across
with the
whole
magnet
city.
and
But that's
pull him
also
through.
that's earlier magnet stuff, and then they use the magnets further. So, but you can kind of tell like they're building around those sequences. They're like, so how do we get these characters here to there? How do we get like the structure of these kind of movies operates differently than something like Marvel because it's not a backlot. You're filming in actual places and you're building it around the actual locations, right? But it also doesn't work like a movie like Independence Day where it's like a tight structure. So I feel like you have to look at the actual action scenes themselves and kind of measure the movie on those. You really do.
I think I agree in part. I think Anders' point about children playing with action figures and watching my own kids, like set up little things and then someone's all of a sudden jumping on the back of a dinosaur and going like that helps me understand kind of the logic of a movie like this. Because I think Mission Impossible is a good parallel, a good comparison. But where I'm more on board for Mission Impossible, and I actually love particularly the later installments in Mission Impossible, but coming in somewhat cold, like I just don't understand that they still have to bring in all the car stuff into like this world. So like I was saying to Anders, it's just like he just has to be driving his
Dodge,
his Dodge through the jungle, and it's just like, and then there just happens to be like a road to the wreck because they can't lose the cars completely, even though they have the other stuff.
But that's why
the
it
thing for me.
really like I just imagine like old even like 80s cartoons with like a G.I. Joe and they have like different like
actually
this is more like G.I. Joe than any G.I. Joe movie, really.
That's a good comparison, like 80s cartoons.
And I think that's why it appeals to like a not necessarily a geek audience who though still grew up in the 80s and 90s with sort of like, vehicular cartoon mayhem and stuff like that. This is why they also like the Michael Bay Transformers movies have been so successful as well. It's the same kind of like more demographic that's not necessarily the guys who are into like Dungeons and Dragons and comic books. Although Vin Diesel is apparently a huge Dungeons and Dragons fan. Soren is very intrigued by that. But like it's people who like cars and like explosions but still like the sort of goofy logic of a cartoon or a comic book.
But yeah, can I just I think that's really interesting that it's the combination of both sort of like, the typical kind of like sort of the classic sort of factors of appeal in like the action film, whether it's like the girls, the guns, the cars, all that sort of stuff. But then there is this like extra layer of like what you've talked about is sort of the mythologizing, where all of a sudden you get like this fully developed sort of world where there's all these different characters who are somehow intertwined, and if you can know that backstory, like it's all a little bit richer. And that's the interesting thing where I think Aaron saying like, they somehow turned this car series into, one of the closest rivals to Marvel is really interesting.
In terms of box office, especially. The other interesting thing about making the Mission Impossible comparison is that it actually reveals something that you kind of alluded to, which is that the like Mission Impossible, the first one, the Brian De Palma film, is actually quite tightly scripted. Like it's, and that's, I've come back as much as I really, really love the last three Mission Impossibles. I do love the first one the best, but there's a tightness to it in the structure, and it's more noirish and more, Hitchcockian, twisty kind of thing. And then, we've talked about the later entries with the way they build around the stunts and locations. Fast and Furious, though, I feel like only really came into its own when Lin took over the series, really. The first two. Which so he directed the third one, but it's particularly in the fourth and fifth that the series like shifts its sort of truly exploitation film in the sense of exploiting like an interest in like urban culture, street racing, Los Angeles, things like that, and then moving that to like Miami, Tokyo, that kind of thing. So the early films actually are less. They're a little bit. There's things to like about them, especially the first one. In part, how much it relies on the formula of Point Break, but it is
the
really
appeal of the first one is about that like I remember like partly was that like getting into like the car world, where if you're not like a street racer, you might not know like how it sort of works.
And the whole like where Nas became like everybody knows about Nas.
Became a thing.
But then it becomes sort of a running gag in the series too, right? The whole use of it. You can't have the film without somebody letting loose a canister of Nas at least once. I think that so it is very instructive to compare it to Mission Impossible, but also shows the way this series I think has actually transcended its origins, not even if insofar as finding a voice and a unique identity.
No, I agree with everything you said. I guess it's what I meant basically with judging the film off the action scenes is more of that's how you can understand these movies as standing out from each other, right? Like Fast Five, part of the reason why people think it's so great is not only bringing Dwayne Johnson in and kind of solidifying the team dynamic, but it's that ridiculous finale, which is
dragging
like
the safes.
Exactly, 2 cars dragging a giant safe through Rio de Janeiro, and it's pitched right on the edge of like camp, but it's still cool, and it's using the cars in a really ingenious way to do the heist. And so it's like it personifies what the action can do within this world they've created.
Here's my question to you guys. In terms of the action sequences, like which was the standout? My question, like you just sort of said how like, pushing it towards camp but not quite. For me, like the magnet play worked. It's outlandish, but they make it work. But the space, I was not on board for.
Agreed. I agree because so this is something I wrote in my review, which is essentially the magnet personifies what's good about this series. You come up with an outlandish thing that ups the stakes of the last one. You incorporate actual stunt work, like the amount of cars they actually totaled in that scene is insane. And you can tell because he cuts to those low angle shots that are sitting right next to the tire to see the like actual impact smashing into the metal. And that's not the kind of weight that you get with a CGI, regardless of how good it is. So he's actually incorporating, real stunt work, real cars being just completely totaled, even if like the flip and them jumping on and off the vehicles is all kind of augmented with studio stuff. But none of it's played for laughs, right? It's played for that's cool.
Yeah.
The space thing is veering into Marvelisms in my mind, where it's taking a character like Tyrese Gibson's Roman, who throughout the series is the Joker type character. He's specifically there to allow a bit of levity and poke fun at the absurdity of what they're doing, but without crossing over. But the fact that he goes to space, which was a long-running joke of like, what are they going to do in the next Fast and Furious movie? Are they going to go to space? And then Justin Lin's like, sure, we'll go to space. But it's played as such a little gag because, yeah, of course it's important for the actual plot to shut down the satellite. It's just like they get there and then they're like, oh, we might die. And then they just end up at this International Space Station later. Like, there's nothing to it beyond doing it, and the doing it is mainly for a joke.
You could have engineered the scripts otherwise.
Which this movie and this series can be very funny. It can, especially I think with Dwayne Johnson and some in the previous entries, Jason Statham. There's a hilarious sequence in Fate of the Furious where it's like riffing on Hard Boiled, where Jason Statham's protecting a baby while he's killing a bunch of guys, and he's constantly pausing and like being like, "Hey baby, you doing all right?" Oh, there's that smile, and then he like shoots 3 guys.
Where's that smile? There it is. You're gonna shoot a baby? You sick bastard.
It's very
Like
John Woo.
that's hilarious because it's it's that the pitch, the tone is so right. But the series is best in like heart on sleeve earnestness, where Dom is sitting there talking to his son and being like, God's inside you. I'm inside you. You never have to worry. Family will always be there for you. The fact that when they get together for a meal in LA, whoever reaches first has to give the prayer, and that's in every of the movies.
First bite, he's got grace. House rules, man. House rules.
It's kind of like you're hitting the formula, but the formula that's specific to this series, but that also is specific to these characters. So by being a Fast and Furious thing, it's also like a Dominic Toretto thing. So it's endearing. And that's why, in my mind, the best part of this movie is the flashback sequences, which is really weird because it has none of the actors. But I actually really like the kind of high-stakes 1950s melodrama that they get out of this story between brothers, who we didn't know this brother existed until this movie.
I will actually note here, though, that one of the things that struck me just about those flashbacks is that today our 1950s sepia-toned flashbacks are 1989. Yeah. And I'm starting to feel real old here.
Anton, those sequences might not have played quite as well for you, but there is a constant allusion, especially in the first movie where he gives a whole speech to Brian. But even in the others, he's always alluding back to this relationship with the father, the formative story of how his father died and how that set him on this course.
But also in Fast 5, he exemplifies how good a guy his dad was, right? When Brian finds out he's going to be a dad. And the whole, how his dad used to, he'd make barbecue for everyone if they went after church. But they had to go to church first. And, you're like, he's painting this picture of this, and actually seeing the flashbacks made me, we could talk about the interesting character thing it did in this film, if you've seen all the movies, is it actually showed us how much of that story of his dad was Dom's rose-colored glasses.
Yes.
Print the legend. He's like the guy who's made the Torettos who they are.
But it's also the thing that allows him to tell the story to others to create the reality that he wasn't able to, right? Like, he's able to make the family he wants because he tells the story of the family than the way it never was.
Exactly.
But on just a basic film level, this is a good example of casting being very important because the actor specifically they have playing young Dom, Vinnie Bennett, is remarkably similar to Vin Diesel. Not just in look or anything, but it's rare that you get a flashback sequence in one of these franchise films where I'm like, that's actually great casting, and I could see them doing another movie where they just keep using him as a younger version of Dom.
Yeah.
Because
we'll do a
in some of these Marvel movies or others, they would de-age them, they would do others. It's no, this trusts basic filmmaking stuff. You just get somebody who has the same charisma as the main actor, but young, unknown, and you just go with it.
It's not really a franchise, Anton, until they have a prequel, though. So there you go. Although I was trying to explain to you the convoluted timeline of the series, how F3 takes place after.
So
Fast
actually,
6.
that's a good segue, because one thing that I would assume, Anton, is incomprehensible to you is all the stuff with Han.
Yeah, the Han stuff was I was I have no idea what's going on. Everyone's sort of weepy about Han, and then Han's secret life as an agent later on, and the daughter he adopts.
And then, Anton, you didn't know that Gal Gadot had been in the series either with the one shot.
Yeah, no, I was like, why is Wonder Woman here? What's going on?
Yeah, that's his love interest through three of them. So the thing with Han is, God bless Justin Lin and how much he loves that character, that he will literally pretzel this series into every possible form to bring him back. It's he dies at the end of Tokyo Drift. Okay, we're going to do retcon 4, 5, 6, all take place before Tokyo Drift, so we can have Han in them. And then Han dies at the end of 6. It fixes, and he meets up with Tokyo Drift, and it's no, we're just gonna make it that he was actually taken to a black site and disappeared through the Kurt Russell character. Just so
even Kurt Russell
Mr. Nobody
on Kurt Russell screaming on a scream, being I'm under attack. I was what is going on here?
But don't you think the fact that they can have Kurt Russell just popping up for this little bit kind of shows?
But there's so much going on in the movie. I even said to Anders, I was like, did he die in that plane crash? Or what happened?
You don't know. It's open-ended.
I do absolutely love. So way back in 2002, when we worked at Blockbuster, I really enjoyed Justin Lin's debut film, Better Luck Tomorrow, a lot.
Yeah,
I bought the DVD and everything. And so I was actually very disappointed at Tokyo Drift when it came out.
Better Luck Tomorrow is a part of the
now,
Fast
that's what I was just going to say.
franchise.
That's his love of Han goes all the way back to Better Luck Tomorrow because, Han is in
Yeah.
Better Luck Tomorrow.
His love of that character.
Sun Kang plays the same character through all these movies, and so retroactively, Better Luck Tomorrow is the prequel to Han in Fast and Furious.
In case listeners haven't seen Better Luck Tomorrow, and it's quite possible you haven't. It was sort of like a indie. It's like a gangster movie, but it's also it's about like Asian American overachievers in SoCal getting into sort of the gangster life. And it's actually a really good movie, and Roger Ebert was like a champion of it at the time. But it's definitely worth checking out. It's, whether or not you're a Fast and Furious fan and you want the backstory on hand.
So in more kind of like a broader view, instead of just going into the nitty gritty of the franchise or mythology and stuff, like, do you think John Cena works as the villain in this? Do you think that it works does he work in this movie, or does it set him up to work well in future movies? Because I think that's kind of a question that you might have two different answers to it.
I'll go first as the person, cold to the franchise. For me, John Cena didn't really work. I just found that, I was saying to Anders on the way out that comparing Vin Diesel to John Cena, they're the brothers. I was like, it's just a total different level of, lead actor acting. Like
charisma?
It's not just the charisma. I think Vin Diesel's definitely a better actor, and he's able to convey a lot. Vin Diesel's character, Dom, doesn't talk a lot, but he's able to convey a lot in his little grunts and when he does make a little comment, a lot in the facial expressions. John Cena, when he has a blank face, has just a blank face. There's a lot of blank face stares, and you're like, yeah. I'm not sure, he's not really conveying anything else. The character, I bought into the kind of the backstory, and it was enjoyable to see, he sort of works, having someone who has sort of an outside, an extra textual presence makes sense in that character role. You couldn't have a nobody, you'd have to have someone who is famous from something. But you're head to head, it's more just in comparison, Vin Diesel versus John Cena. One of these guys deserves to be a movie star. We'll see, what happens in Guardians of the Galaxy, Suicide Squad. But
yeah, and I think I've noticed a lot of other critics talk about Cena in this movie, and it's specifically the fact that it doesn't let him be funny, which is one of his greatest strengths as a performer.
Oh yeah, okay.
He's very good in comedies at cutting into the fact that he looks like a meathead. He's a wrestler mainly.
For instance, Amy Schumer's movie Trainwreck, I thought he was a highlight of the movie.
He's very funny. He's very funny even in that stupid Will Ferrell, Mark Wahlberg series where they're the two co-dads or whatever. The reason I phrased the question that way is that I find him actually unsatisfying as the big bad here, especially when you have Charlize Theron in the box. We haven't even mentioned her as Cypher, who's the big bad in the last movie and clearly going to be the big bad in future movies. She has such a she doesn't do anything here, but she's Charlize Theron. She knows how to say the lines. She knows how to do the give the look on camera, and you can just, from the little bits you get with her, you're yeah, of course she's the more formidable figure here.
And we get that little Star Wars sequence.
Oh, that was funny.
That was really good.
But with John Cena, it's he really is the little brother in the confrontations with Dom. He comes across as even though he's huge, he comes across as diminutive both emotionally and just presence on screen. But all that being said, in the finale, when he kind of turns against Cypher and you realize that she's letting him out to dry, and he teams up with his brother briefly to kind of save the day, I found it satisfying, and there's that little moment shared between them before he drives off, which made me think that there's potential to grow this character and the relationship. And that might be hugely a result of how successful the flashback sequences are, that we actually are invested in this brother relationship. But I don't know. I'm optimistic going forward, and I think Cena clearly wants to prove himself. He's no Dwayne Johnson, he's no Jason Statham, he's no Luke Evans. He doesn't have that.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. I think a lot of my satisfaction with the character and the character arc comes from what they did in the flashback sequences. I don't dislike John Cena, but I'm not sure that he felt strong enough to me that I would be it's not a slam dunk they bring him back. And it would work just fine if we don't see him again for 5 films and he has a little cameo to remind us that there's another Toretto.
That's true.
But it wouldn't hurt the series in the way that if they had just dropped Cypher, it would have, right? Because Charlie she's relishing this opportunity to play that kind of villain, hammy Bond villain, right?
So she's first in number 8.
Yeah, and I'm assuming she'll be the villain through the rest of the series, like the Blofeld character.
Until it becomes unprofitable.
I think they said they're only making 2 more.
I'll
Because
believe
Vin
it
Diesel's
when I
getting
see
too
it,
old.
but-
I think he said that they'll do maybe some like flashback movies, but like solo Toretto, young Dom movies. But yeah, it's true. He's so wedded to this franchise. So I didn't say that, but like Universal owns the Fast and Furious franchise. What's their other big franchise? Right, it's Jurassic Park. You know how much people are clamoring for a crossover between these series? And the thing is, with the absurdity of the Fast and Furious franchise, it's like, if they had dinosaurs, I wouldn't be too shocked.
Well, they've already gone pretty absurd
like
in Jurassic Park, so you could do it.
They've been talking for a couple of years about that idea of, and I think after Jurassic World Dominion or whatever this next year, that might lay the groundwork for something like that.
Overall, Anders, like, where would you rank F9 compared to the others?
For me overall, I'd say it's maybe on par or a little below 8. I'd rank 5, 6, 7 my favorites. 5, I think, easily the best. Then 6, 7. Then I would put 8, 9, and 4 roughly the same. Although 4 has a couple of really standout things, and I credit it for truly making the shift in the series. So yeah, it's middle of the pack, I'd say.
Kind of want to rewatch 4 because I feel like after rewatching this whole series, it's the one that, it makes me, because I've now invested in these characters, I want to go back to that because it establishes the kind of blockbuster formula for them. But it also does have just some awesome stunts. Like that opening in the Dominican.
Yeah, that opening, the
oil,
tanker heist is awesome.
Aaron, have you been watching this series for years now? Or
so
you binged as well?
I specifically was like, there's a good chance F9 is the first movie I see in theaters. Because it's going to be the big blockbuster. I don't really want to go see Black Widow as my first movie in theaters. So, after pandemic reopening, and I'm like, I want to enjoy it properly, so I'm going to watch The 8. Because, on the last episode of this, we were talking about 90s action movies, and then I've been watching, like, the Riddick films. I've been watching a lot of throwback action, and I'm just like, the Fast and Furious franchise, no matter how bloated they are, no matter how much they can draw in these things of modern films, they really do feel like they're rooted in that pre-9/11, like tail end of the 90s kind of optimism of what you can do with an action franchise, and just it seems to be the one large franchise I can think of that keeps that ethos alive of just like, it's just a sequel, and you're gonna, it can get complicated, but it's gonna be more action, and it's just gonna be superstars and this international cast, and like it doesn't work if you don't get Vin Diesel.
Yeah. That's actually why I mentioned to Anton that I feel like, as much as it is definitely, no question, I'm not going to debate that it's part of like the contemporary franchise, cycle and everything, but it does feel even more of a throwback to me even than 80s and 90s. I think there's a little bit of a classic Hollywood kind of like feel to this with its appreciation of high melodrama, of character despite having spectacle, and all that kind of stuff. So I think there's something really classical about it, even though
also
they're not all
thematics.
amazing.
Remember, also the 60s had that period of like the car chase movie.
Mm-hmm, exactly. Like the characters and the family story and stuff like that.
That seems very classic Hollywood, like 40s, 50s.
Totally.
It's rare that I feel like these movies have a little bit more of like a moral to the message than like your average blockbuster. And I'll, to give it credit, I'll say that like the family sort of dynamic seems a little bit more earned than some other franchises try to get sort of emotional or deep.
See, Anton, you have to go back and rewatch. You have to watch I think you should watch 5, 6, 7 just so you can kind of get the emotional pinnacle of the series, which works with the off-screen death of Paul Walker. And it works so well with the melodrama of this series and its tributes towards like pure emotion between like dudes. Furious 7 kind of ends with this letting Paul Walker ride off into the sunset. And if you read it on paper, if you hear a description of it, it sounds so cheesy and bad. And you watch it and you're just like, bless.
It's been a while. The roads were a little empty. Places where we used to gather went quiet. We've gone through a year that tested us, but we're starting to see the promise of a new day. For more than 100 years, there's one place where we all came together to be entertained, to escape, to go someplace new, The movies. There's nothing like that moment when the lights go down. The projector ignites. And we believe.
Movie theaters are finally back. The United States and other parts of Canada may have never had theaters close outright, or if they did, they had them reopen in late spring, but here in Ontario, movie theaters have finally reopened, making it once again possible to see a movie in the way it's intended. While there was a brief moment last summer when movie theaters reopened and films such as Christopher Nolan's Tenet attempted to reignite the domestic box office, viewers largely stayed away from theaters and the film only managed $57 million domestically. Pundits worried that the theatrical window had died and that the domestic box office was not going to last long even after the pandemic. Luckily, it seems that news of the death of movie theaters has been greatly exaggerated. While the domestic box office has not entirely rebounded to pre-pandemic levels, there is a growing appetite for returning to the theater to see movies, even those movies that are simultaneously offered on streaming at home. So you have Godzilla vs. Kong, which was probably the first big release in theaters this spring, coming out at the end of March in the United States, and it's grossed around $100 million, even though it was also playing on HBO Max. More recently, you got A Quiet Place Part 2 and Black Widow, which have both grossed around $150 million each domestically, even though both those films are also available on streaming, with Quiet Place Part 2 on Amazon Prime and Black Widow available for rent on Disney+. And of course, the top grosser at the 2021 box office so far, any guesses? It's F9, which is not offered on streaming, surprise, but it's made around $163 million and counting, which, to be fair, is not up to the levels of the previous films in the series, which were all kind of $200 to $300 million grossers, but it's a far cry from the meager gross of something like Tenet. So, looking at these grosses, seeing movies back in the theaters, are we actually seeing movie theaters return, or are we just kind of in an artificial bubble that people are enthusiastic about post-pandemic going out there and doing things, and then they'll just tail off? Like, what do you guys think, Anders?
No, I think what we're seeing is movies slowly return to something more similar to like actually having significant theatrical releases and box office. But I don't think streaming and simultaneous streaming is going away. I think that stuff was going to start happening anyway, pandemic or no pandemic. Maybe this speeded it up a bit, but I think so. I think what we're seeing is a rebound of movie going to some degree. So we will recover from the pandemic depression to the movies, but I think that what will happen is movies will return to a previous level, though I think that we will sort of see the end of some of the artificially overinflated box offices of the last few years from like saturation and stuff like that, because we'll get simultaneous streaming releases. So we won't have those like the $800 billion grossers like Force Awakens and Infinity War and stuff like that. But I think we'll get back up to having like, a 200-300 mil grosser, but that will also do well on streaming on whoever's service.
Do you think that the one type of movie that will most be affected in terms of box office with the simultaneous on streaming is like children's films? Because why would you pay the tickets for kids if you can just see Trolls
also,
or the
you can
Croods
get,
at home?
or even if you're paying for it, you could get like 5 or 6 kids over and rent it, and it's cheaper.
But I guess this actually raises something that I've been thinking about, which is I think this is magnified coming out of the pandemic, but part of the point of a movie, and this is hard for someone who's passionate about movies as a art form, but like part of the point of movies for a lot of us is to just get out of the house.
Yeah.
And like I think we underestimate that that's a motivating factor sometimes when we go see movies, especially when you get into like film buff talks, and we even assume that people are just going to see a movie because they like really want to see this work. A lot of the times it's literally like, I want to get out of the house this weekend. Let's go see a movie.
People will show up at the box office and be like, pick one randomly.
But I think this is big for teenagers where there's not as many places to go hang out. So movie theaters, are going to be a place where like people are still going to want to go somewhere. And so if movie theaters are open, I think they'll still draw a segment of the audience. What my biggest concern is actually what this does to basically like the art house or indie films, and apart from sort of a theater that can curate that for a particular audience and keep that going, I don't know if they're going to even be in the multiplexes, because I don't know if you're going to, like, usually you're having 10 people show up in the theater for some of these movies. I don't know if they're even going to dump them in the theater.
Well, that actually interesting on that point, that may end up benefiting some independent movie theaters like in Waterloo and Kitchener, the Princess Cinema and Apollo Cinema, because if Cineplex and Landmark aren't going to carry sort of mid-tier or lower films in terms of budget and like distribution and stuff like that, they might lose even less to Cineplex and stuff, and you might actually have you might get some movies that exclusively to you that you wouldn't have gotten exclusively before.
Here's my thought, is that one of my problems with streaming is curation. Like, I don't like algorithmic recommends. They don't work for me. It's not how I operate when I'm trying to figure out what to watch. So I don't want these vague, stupid categories of like a descriptor that like Netflix gives me. I just want to see like what the new release is, or I want to be able to easily search by like director. That's like the way my mind operates. It's still back to the video store. But I think like an art house, maybe this just an idea, but like going forward, you're like, if you can manage a curation where like people will trust that you're finding and bringing those, because the hard thing about independent films on streaming is finding them. Unless you're following other writers who are recommending them, it can be really hard to even notice they're there.
I will say the streaming services that I have, like Mubi and Criterion Channel, that are curated rather than algorithmically oriented, do often drive that kind of a different kind of viewing for me. Like Criterion will put together a program essentially of like 10 films from a genre, director or actor or something like that, and I find that really satisfying.
Yeah, and I'm so in Toronto, like the TIFF Bell Lightbox hasn't opened up yet, but I'm not really worried about them. Like, they will rebound. There is such a solid base of people who are like, I can't wait to, obviously the festival itself, but like there's that contingent of newly retired, artistically interested culture people who are like, they go see 3 movies a week, and it's whatever's playing at the Lightbox is what they're seeing, because they know that it's curated for them by film programmers who do the festival, so it's going to be the important international or independent films. And you get other theaters, you get theaters like the Royal or whatever, and like those theaters have been kind of switched into second run, and then all the kind of interesting little independent or art house or review stuff they play has already kind of broken down into these little curated programs. You'll have kind of like a drunk cinema thing, and then you'll have and you're gonna get like 1 or 2 nights a month where they put on the program, and it's these same hosts that do it, and they pick the movie, and then the crowd of 100 people who follow these people on Twitter or whatever get to see them in person, and that's like kind of how they've been approaching this and staying alive in general. So I don't think that's gonna go away either. I do think that the multiplex is gonna consolidate. They're not going to have 3 cinemas in the city. They're going to have 1. Most of those screens are going to be for Disney films, like they already are. But I think my biggest worry comes from with those smaller features where a distributor is just like so desperate for any amount of money that can come into it. They'll put it onto a digital release, and it'll just get swallowed into the maw and do crap for like 2 months. And then a multiplex or even a smaller second run theater is not going to pick it up, because they're like, well, nobody's talking about that because it just disappeared. Like, by having that simultaneous window, it doesn't work simultaneous for the indie things, because they generally actually have like a slow drip 1 or 2 month just digital.
This was a problem already before the pandemic.
I know, but it's going to become more, I think.
Yeah. But what I'm saying is like that was going to get worse and worse. The pandemic may have speeded it up, but this is a trend. So what I'm generally saying is, I think we'll see the continuation of trends that were going on in distribution, viewing, attendance, everything before the pandemic. The pandemic may have just speeded everything up a little bit.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, I don't think there's going to be who knows, but I don't think there's going to be kind of like a Parasite this year, or a movie like that where it's that kind of mid-level hit that gets the word of mouth for 4 months and just makes a good amount of money and then wins all the awards just based off that. But do you think there's any potential for some of these movies coming out in the fall? Because there's a lot of these blockbusters that were pushed from last year that are like huge scale, like the tentpole of tentpoles that they wouldn't want to risk in a pandemic, right, release. So you got James Bond, you got Dune. It could go either way. Do you think there's a potential for James Bond to be like a huge hit?
Yeah,
because every single person in the world wants to go see the new James Bond.
There are a lot
movie
more
in theaters.
Bond film fans than you know. They're like people who aren't like that. There are diehard Bond people who who will go see that movie who wouldn't see other movies. And
Yeah.
they go up to quite an older age too.
But what I mean is, like, do you think there's a thing where basically you have a lot of normal people who are like, I haven't seen a movie in 2 years. There's a new Bond movie, and I feel safe to go out, so I'm gonna go to the Bond movie. I'm not really a movie guy, but I'm gonna see the Bond movie.
Mm-hmm. I know who Daniel Craig
and
is.
then that creates a kind of like artificial. Everybody thinks that like, oh my goodness, blockbusters are back. But then on the flip side, do you think something like Dune is just gonna like absolutely bomb and just like take out a huge corner of the, like, you know, Warner's just never gonna throw money at anything that's not a DC product ever again.
I could see either of those things happening or not.
I do think that this is just based on like talking to people, but like I do feel like there is, even at the same time, like I mentioned, that there's a desire sometimes to just get out of the house and go see a movie. I also do think people have gotten very comfortable and attuned to like streaming as like their main source of entertainment, and like so I do think like I can't tell like what the numbers would be, but I also do think that there's probably a small segment that is kind of thought they never were that passionate about going to the theater, and have just been sort of like, yeah, it's not really like worth the effort, and they'll maybe see one movie a year, but it was never a big priority previously. It was just something you did, and we've maybe lost that segment. They just, if they're gonna have simultaneously, they'll just use this as the excuse to stay home.
So it's kind of like the full transition of movies for a certain segment of the population into just content, which is the way the industry's already treating it, but like segment, you know, it takes certain genres, obviously like the diehard Marvel fans are going to go see the Marvel movie opening night. Horror movie audiences are always going to go see horror movies because being scared with others is like the whole appeal. Yeah. And then like broad comedies, you want to laugh with other people. But do people care whether their DreamWorks animated film is on Netflix or in the theater?
I really enjoyed the last Pixar movie just on Disney. Didn't hurt my appreciation of it.
I think those will often play at home. I think you're right about that in the sense of like it's the weekend.
Put it on.
People put it on for their kids because, you know, like you might even, because then you can do it. You know, the convenience of it will be a big draw. I think for a lot of the
like people don't realize how many subscriptions Disney Plus sold in the last 2 years. Like it's insane. Their growth was unprecedented. Like the number of American and North American families who have a Disney Plus subscription is huge for exactly the reasons you mentioned, Anton.
It's to put on all those old Disney movies without having to buy them anymore.
But actually, and the new ones are an added like value. Like people are really excited about even still watching. Like the number of other parents and people have said, "Oh, have you seen this Pixar?"
They have the franchises too.
But even the Pixar, right?
Like, yeah, and they get the Marvel for the dad in the evening, or the Disney, or like, you know, they have all those like holiday fare too and stuff.
Yeah.
It's funny how this kind of, the current on the podcast has become just the endless talk about content and the streaming wars and the death
I know,
of
we've
cinemas.
been beating these bushes for a long time now.
But I guess we're going to get some answers soon. It's possible. I do often think back to those, what was it, like 2013, the George Lucas, Steven Spielberg comments of like, just wait for 2 or 3 of these big blockbusters to go down. And in my mind, it's very much, I have like a little sticky note where when you see, if one Marvel movie underperforms, that won't be it. But when 2 Marvel movies underperform, this whole industry is shifting. And I'm very curious when those are going to happen because, you know, Black Widow, it's underperforming relatively.
But you get the pandemic.
But it's the pandemic, so you can't
that
really
doesn't
blame
count.
it. But if Eternals collapses this fall, like, is that a different
and
story?
Shang-Chi and...
I don't think either of those, like, who's excited for those?
But that speaks to what we were talking about with Fast and the Furious, where it's like, my concern sometimes is like, I just want some of these things to fail, simply that, like, it ends the cycle. It's just that, like, I actually think that, like, why partly I haven't followed Marvel that much in the past couple of years, except for the very biggest ones, is that it started to feel like too much. They keep drawing more and more of your attention. They want you to not only watch the series, but also watch all the episodes. Star Wars is going to be heading in that direction. And just like, it's too much. You're like, I want to like watch movies. I don't want to just live in the Marvel world. I love Star Wars. I don't want to just live in a Star Wars world where all my content's Star Wars.
But it's even more cynical than that, and it's even kind of based off of video game industry logic, where it's, you buy the new video game, you say you buy the new Call of Duty.
Yeah.
Lots of these new games are either free or a portion of it is free or it's a base rate, but it's like you turn it on, you try and play this main story. Actually, it's only a 2-hour like preview of the story. You have to pay the extra to get the other part of the story, or it assumes that you've read the novelizations or these web series episodes that were on YouTube or on Twitch or something. And it's just like, why all your content is doing is just being like, you need to go seek out this other content, and then that content is just like, oh, you should seek out this content that sent you here, and it's just this like simulacra thing of just going round and round, and it's frustrating on like a pure user level. Like even if you take all the art out of it as like a consumer, it's frustrating. Like,
it's almost like Kafkaesque. Like
no, but like, can't you just give me a single unit?
Because all
it's an
movies,
Ouroboros. It just swallows.
Yeah. All these movies, right? Like, Hollywood movie making. It's always been about the commercial side, but there's this extra level of like give me your life, give me all your time into consuming this content. Like it's just so obvious the way they'll like try to like extend it that like it gets to me it's like it gets unreasonable, and you're like I'm not gonna devote my life to seeing every Marvel connection. Like I can't do that.
If you were to stumble across our civilization from a million years in the future, you wouldn't be unreasonable to imagine that some people were acolytes of a Marvel cult, that they spent all their time and devotion to these stories. They decorated their shirts and houses and posters and toys, and they ate from a Marvel branded water bottle, and they were acolytes of Marvel, and the same thing for Star Wars.
But
and
it goes
things.
even further, is that the majority of their engagement with the world was correcting the, like, to use a Marvel term, like the sacred timeline of events. It's like, no, that's not actually the correct like trivial piece. This is how it fits all together. And
so they participate.
It's like, yeah, the engagement with story is actually just a means of showing that you watched the story, and it's just a very like literal minded way of going about things.
I always thought it wasn't one of Terry Gilliam's best films, but Zero Theorem, there was the Church of like the Holy Batman in the future, and I actually kind of think we may arrive there at some point.
Resigned sigh.
Well, on that happy note, I think we're gonna leave it there for today. So please check out our written content at threebrothersfilm.com. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook, which is at threebrothersfilm. Thanks so much for listening. Hope to catch you next time on the next episode of Three Brothers Filmcast.
Goodbye, Mr. Bond.
I bid you farewell.